That foggy morning in Seoul, the streets felt quieter than usual. The damp concrete reflected the gray tones of the sky, as if the city so used to haste was waiting for something that didn't yet have a name. At the top of a mirrored building, surrounded by numbers that defined the fate of many, a group of candidates awaited the start of an interview that seemed to be just another one. But at WSN single quotes. The man who entered the room carried a strange silence on his shoulders. He wore clothes far too simple for that environment, worn-out shoes that clashed with the polished floor's shine, and an old wristwatch that seemed to have survived more than time itself. No one stood when he arrived. Not out of direct contempt, but out of a reflex deeply rooted in a culture that still measures worth by appearance. And he knew that better than anyone. He sat at the end of the table like someone watching a staged performance from a distance. Each face there was a bet. Rehearsed smiles, trained postures, restless eyes full of ambition. But none of them knew that the man with the plain appearance and quiet presence was the real owner of everything that surrounded them. Not an employee, not an EVLUATOR. But the billionaire who had vanished from the spotlight 3 years ago. Jin. As a Jin wasn't looking for just a new assistant. He was searching for humanity. After the death of his father, heir to an empire built on blood and sacrifice, he decided to erase his own name from the market, not out of cowardice, but disillusionment. He discovered that the greatest inheritance wasn't in the figures, but in the silences no one dared to hear. And so he created a silent, invisible, but relentless plan. For months, he infiltrated as an intern, assistant, driver in his own company. He saw how people mistreated others without knowing who they were. He overheard jokes about the missing boss. He noted glances, reactions, whispered comments. He wasn't looking for respect. He was looking for truth. And on that specific day, he decided to be the interviewer, just one more among many. Or at least, that's what everyone thought. The first candidate walked in wearing cologne far too expensive for an autumn morning. He greeted only the coordinator beside him, ignoring the calm-looking man in the corner. The second candidate smiled with her teeth, but not with her eyes. She asked questions about bonuses before even hearing about the position. The third wore his surname like an invisible badge, casting condescending glances as if he were above. The interview. None of them truly saw him. Jin listened, observed, took mental notes. The answers were polished, rehearsed, absolutely empty. They were specialists in impressing, but knew nothing about listening. They didn't know how to hesitate. They didn't know how to be grateful. Each gesture confirmed one thing: the company had grown faster than its essence. And maybe it was time to return to the beginning. A beginning none of them knew, but he remembered in every detail. Then the door opened slowly, as if it carried a story that needed to ask for permission. Kang Ha-yoon entered with firm steps and attentive eyes. She wore a simple, clean, well-ironed outfit. Her hair was tied back with discretion. Her trembling hands held a notebook covered in floral fabric, the kind of detail that reveals more than it seems. When her eyes met his, she gave a full bow. He was nobody, but she showed respect. Ha-yoon was born in the Guryong neighborhood, where zinc-roofed houses hear the rain before the people do. She grew up among needles, threads, and interrupted stories. Her mother sewed for survival, but embroidered dreams into the scraps. And from those dreams came the daughter, who now sat before men, who would never know what it was like to study while hungry or walk for hours to a night class not knowing if there would be light at home when she returned. She answered the questions without haste. She didn't use complex words, but each sentence carried the weight of someone who knew exactly what she was saying. She spoke about organization with real-life examples, about empathy with personal stories, about ethics with tearful eyes. When she mentioned working 3 jobs at once to pay for her mother's surgery, the coordinator cleared his throat and looked away. But Jin didn't blink. There was no self-pity in her words. There was dignity. The same dignity he once saw in his mother's hands before illness took the shine from her eyes. There was something in Ha-Yoon that disarmed people. Something that can't be learned in MBAs or cultivated at gala dinners. Something raw, shaped by life, and for that reason, true. Some laughed when she said she still used public transportation. Others frowned when she admitted she had never traveled abroad. But she continued, steady. She spoke to be heard, not to be applauded. And in the silence between each answer, there was more wisdom than in all the speeches given by the previous candidates. At the end, she stood up, bowed again, and expressed her thanks. But not with a mechanical smile, with genuine gratitude. She left a handmade card on the table with a simple phrase, "Thank you for listening to me. I promise to always listen too." Then she walked out with the same lightness she came in, as if she carried the world, yet still left no footprints. When the door closed, no one commented on her. No jokes, no critiques, just indifference. The coordinator murmured that maybe she was fit for the customer service department. Another added, "Simple people tend to cause less trouble, right?" Then Seye-jin stood up, slowly, without anger, without haste, but with something in his eyes that few could recognize, resolve. He picked up the card gently, as one handles a rare piece of an ancestral puzzle. He left the room without saying a word. And as he walked through the glass corridors, he thought about all the rooms where people like her never had a chance to enter. He thought of muffled voices, invisible merits, and stories that never reached the top not because of talent, but because of lack of a surname. In the days that followed, he would make choices that would change the direction of the company. But first, he needed to see her once more. Not to congratulate her, not to promote her, but to listen to what she didn't say. Because there are truths that only live in silence. And finally, he was ready to hear them. So before this story moves toward the unexpected, subscribe to the channel now, like this video, and activate the notifications so you don't miss a single episode. What's coming next will shake everything you believe in. This is your free dorama channel here on YouTube. In the days that followed, Kang Hae-yoon returned to her quiet routine. Between disorganized shelves of a small stationery store in the basement of Samsung Station and the long walks back home, where her mother remained bedridden, dependent on constant care. The interview seemed to have been just another among so many that ended in silence. No emails, no calls, no broken promises, because she had stopped expecting promises a long time ago. But for Jang Sa-jin, those days were anything but normal. He didn't return to the central office. Instead, he began revisiting the security cameras from the operational floors of the company, the evaluation reports, and the personal histories of all the candidates. He wasn't looking for numbers. He was looking for gestures. While his directors argued through cold spreadsheets and colorful graphs, he, alone in a modest room on the top floor, kept rewatching that interview, not for the words, but for what was left between them. The look she gave when she saw the company logo on the wall. The hesitation when speaking about her mother. The way she adjusted her skirt discreetly before sitting down, trying to appear strong. Each detail revealed layers that no resume could ever show. But it also revealed something else. That she would never be accepted by the polished elite he himself had helped to shape. And it was in that realization that the decision was born, one that would change everything. The next morning, a message was sent to her phone. Short, direct, almost cold. Report to the company headquarters tomorrow at 10 a.m. Confirm attendance. Ha-yoon read the text like someone reading a sentence. There was no name, no compliment. Just a time. She replied with a yes, thank you, and spent the rest of the day washing the same 2 sets of business clothes she owned, trying to decide which would look less repeated. At the office, the HR coordinator scoffed upon hearing about the summons. He grumbled that they should warn us when they decide to hire people outside the standard. and spent the morning rearranging the list of finalists as if erasing an uncomfortable stain. But her name remained on the agenda, because it was in the hands of someone no one dared to question, even without knowing what he truly intended. Hyun arrived early. She sat in the lobby with her bag on her lap, her heart pounding in her chest and her breath held in silence. The receptionist didn't know who she was. And when she asked to speak with the person mentioned in the message, someone called Mr. Jang, she received only a surprised nod, as if no one there was aware of the appointment. But 10 minutes later, an elevator descended from the top floor, and the very man who had interviewed her appeared. Without saying a word, he guided her through the corridors like someone carrying out a mission. The sound of their footsteps echoed like a secret about to be revealed. They passed through luxurious departments, where secretaries mumbled automatic greetings and directors pretended not to see, until they stopped in front of a frosted glass door with golden letters, Executive Directorate, and Next Room. Inside the room, there was no luxury. Just a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a window overlooking the city. He pointed to the seat and waited for her to sit. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but firm. He said only, "Before I decide anything, I want you to tell me what no one else asked that day." She furrowed her brow, confused. He insisted, "What did you hold back so you wouldn't seem weak?" Hyun didn't respond right away. There was something about that question that disarmed her internally. She took a deep breath, looked at her trembling hands, and with a threat of voice, told him about the night she thought of giving up. When her mother fell into a coma and she lost 2 jobs at once. When she ate only rice with water for 3 days to be able to pay the electric bill. And when, even so, she decided not to sell the notebook where she wrote down her dreams. He listened, in silence. And when she finished, he didn't say whether that was good or bad. He simply stood, took an envelope from the table, and handed it to her. "Sign this, if you want the job. But no, it won't be easy. You weren't chosen for your resume. You were chosen because I saw in you something the whole world tries to hide. Truth." She hesitated, read the contract twice, and signed with trembling hands. That same day, the company's hallways began to stir. The news spread too quickly. The simple girl had been hired to work directly with the president. No one knew who authorized it. No one dared to ask. But everyone began to observe. And as always happens in places where power walks disguised, as formality, glances became weapons. Hyun began to be ignored in the corridors. Colleagues avoided direct contact. Secretaries whispered when she passed by. And even when she smiled, the air around her remained cold. But she endured everything, in silence as she always had. After all, surviving was never a choice for her. It was a necessity. One afternoon, while organizing old documents in a file room, she found a framed photograph fallen between boxes of paper. In it, a young man smiled beside the company's founder, and his face was eerily familiar. She recognized the eyes, the shape of the jaw, the quiet posture. It was the man who had interviewed her. But the name tag said something else. Honorary Director, Jang Seki-jin. She felt a chill down her spine. Returned to her desk, trying to act natural. But the thought kept hammering. Who was he really? Why was he hiding behind another name? And why had he chosen her? The doubt became uncomfortable, but she decided to remain silent. Because there was something about that mystery that seemed larger than she could understand. At the top of the company, Seki-jin watched everything through the cameras. He saw the glances thrown her way, heard the whispers, saw the coffee that wasn't served to her. And he also saw the way she, even in the face of everything, continued treating everyone with respect. How she folded her blouse carefully before putting on the uniform. How she said thank you even when ignored. How she helped colleagues who pretended not to see her. It was there that his decision gained strength. In a restricted meeting, one of The board members dared to question her presence. He said that the company's image was at stake. Zhejian responded with only one sentence. If the company's image depends on appearances, then we're already bankrupt. The room fell silent, and no one dared to continue the subject. Meanwhile, Ha-Yun received a special task to organize the founder's personal files for a future commemorative exhibition. Alone, in a forgotten archive, she dove into old papers, handwritten letters, records of quiet donations, and journals that revealed more than any board meeting ever had. It was there, among pages yellowed by time, that she found a sealed envelope with Zheng Zhejian's name handwritten on it, and inside was something that could change not only her job but the entire story of that family. But she didn't know that yet, and for now, she decided not to open it. Over the following days, the envelope remained hidden among Ha-Yun's belongings, guarded with reverent care, as if she were carrying something sacred or dangerous. She couldn't explain why she hadn't opened it yet. Maybe it was fear of what she might find. Maybe it was instinct. But there was something about that old handwriting, that yellowed paper, that made her feel the secret inside wasn't hers alone, and that opening it would mean crossing an invisible line from which there would be no return. Her work routine grew increasingly quiet. There was progress in the projects, veiled praise from supervisors, but no real gesture of welcome. Ha-Yun was efficient, polite, always attentive. But she was alone, and she knew it. The hallway where her desk was located always seemed colder, as if the air there didn't circulate the same way. The laughter died down when she approached. Lunch groups never included her. Still, somehow that never stopped her from smiling. Even if only inside, Zhejian followed everything in silence. He observed meetings, reports, unnoticed gestures. More than numbers, he studied human reactions. The way colleagues averted their eyes when she arrived. The impatient tone in which they asked her for documents. The fake smiles when she did something right. It was as if each detail was silently writing a thesis about corporate hypocrisy. One night, while riding the subway home, Ha-Yun felt she was being followed. She turned around a few times but saw nothing but ordinary faces, tired passengers at the end of the day. Still, when she reached her neighborhood station, she walked faster. The street was deserted, and the streetlights flickered as if undecided. Upon entering her house, she locked the door twice. She felt a strange discomfort, as if someone knew something she herself did not. The next morning, upon arriving at work, she found an anonymous note on her desk. On it, just a single handwritten sentence. Be careful with what you uncover. Not all files want to be read. There was no signature, no explanation. But the paper, folded meticulously, carried the same scent she had once sensed. In the elevator with one of the company's board members, fear didn't paralyze her. On the contrary, it reignited something inside. A subtle suspicion that had already been growing. She returned to the central archive and resumed her reading with more attention. She began to cross-check dates, documents, signatures. She discovered that many records of donations made by the company's founder had been omitted from official reports. That names of close family members were missing from important lists. And stranger still, that there had been a social project, abandoned shortly before the patriarch's death, a project called Invisible Roots. She brought the notes to her desk, copied the data into her personal notebook, and tried to find more information. But every time she accessed the company system, she encountered restrictions, locked files, encrypted folders, expired passwords. It was as if someone knew what she was looking for and was erasing the trail before she could reach it. Meanwhile, at the top of the company, a new conflict was beginning. A group of directors began pressuring the board for strategic changes. They claimed the company's image needed to be protected, that new faces were destabilizing the internal culture. Although no names were mentioned, everything pointed to the fact that Hyun's presence had bothered more people than anyone was willing to admit. And among these directors, one name stood out. Lee Hyun-woo, vice president and nephew of the founder's late wife. Hyun-woo had always been seen as the natural successor before SVP Jin's unexpected return. And since then, his influence had been shrinking. Silently, he began planting doubts, gathering allies, studying the company's legal structure. He didn't just want power. He wanted full control. And the presence of an assistant without a strong surname and without a reliable past was the perfect excuse to trigger chaos. Ha-Eun, unaware of the growing conspiracy, continued her work with dedication. But little by little, she began to notice subtle changes, documents that never arrived, meetings canceled at the last minute, pitying looks she couldn't understand. And then came the most unexpected blow. She was relocated. No explanation, no notice, no choice. From the executive sector, she was sent to the 7th floor, an isolated area used only for inactive files. She received the news with a faded smile. She didn't ask the reason. She simply gathered her things and walked to the new room with slow steps. Upon arrival, she found a dusty space, windowless, with dim lights and old furniture. But ironically, she also found something she hadn't expected. Freedom. In the silence of that forgotten room, she could work without hostile glances. She could read the old documents without rush. She could think. And it was there, on the 3rd day, that she decided to open the envelope she had been guarding for weeks. She sat alone, her hands trembling, and slowly broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter and an old photograph. The letter was signed by Jeng Gwang-ho, the company's founder. The photo showed 2 children playing in a garden. One of them, without a doubt, was young Zeka Jin, the other she couldn't identify. The words in the letter spoke of regrets, of children outside of marriage, of moral debts, of inheritances that were not just financial. The letter ended with an enigmatic sentence. If one day, someone with steady eyes and wounded hands finds this envelope, it's because my mistake has returned to be corrected. Hyun folded the letter carefully. Her heart pounded so hard. She could barely breathe. There was something there that still needed to be deciphered. And for the first time, she began to consider a possibility she had never dared to think. She wasn't there by accident. Meanwhile, in his office, Sage Jin observed the activity on the 7th floor through an old camera. He saw when she opened the envelope, saw the exact moment her eyes fixed on the letter. And for a moment, he seemed to breathe as if he had been waiting for that his whole life. But he also knew he wasn't the only one watching, and that Hyun-woo's eyes were everywhere. Game he had started in silence was now being played by others. And this time, not everyone was willing to follow the rules. The next day, upon arriving at the company, Hyun found her office locked. A notice taped to the door said that the archive department would undergo an urgent structural revision. No email had been sent. No protocol had been followed. It was as if, suddenly, her presence there had become too uncomfortable to keep ignoring. The files she had compiled over the past few days, folders with notes, memos, historical documents, had disappeared. She went down to the reception desk with a pale face, trying to maintain composure. She asked to speak with the infrastructure department, but was told that no official request had been registered. She tried contacting HR, but the call went straight to voicemail. Finally, she attempted to message the number previously used by Jeng Jin, but the automatic response said that the number no longer existed. Something inside her, however, had already changed. The young woman who once hesitated in front of closed doors now began to push them open with resolve. And with that determination, she went up to the executive floor and knocked on the door of the office where she had been interviewed for the first time. The room was empty, the furniture replaced, the curtains different, no sign of him. No trace of the presence that once seemed to observe every detailed dot in the cafeteria. Whispers were no longer disguised. Some said she had messed with what she shouldn't have. Others bet she would be fired soon. There were even those who claimed she was being investigated for unauthorized use of confidential documents. Nothing had been confirmed. But in a culture where silence weighs more than evidence, rumors become verdicts. On the other side of the building, in a wing accessible only to board members, Hyun Woo was meeting with a private lawyer. On the table lay a black folder with the seal of the company's holding group. Inside were documents that had been compiled over months, records of suspicious financial transactions, old testimonies from former employees, and an unofficial dossier on the emotional instability of Jang Zegi-jin. The objective was clear: to call an emergency, vote questioning the CEO's administrative sanity, and legally seize control of the presidency. Hyun's presence was just a catalyst, a symbol of disruption he would use to convince the others that Sejin was abandoning rationality by employing people without the right profile, without preparation, without an adequate background. The speech would be grounded, cold, technically irrefutable, and the attack would happen within days. Meanwhile, Seki-jin had left Seoul. He withdrew to an old house in the mountains of Gangwon, where his father used to spend winters writing letters never sent. There, among cold fireplaces and shelves full of books with scribbled notes in the margins, he searched for clarity. The letter he had left for Hyun to find had been written years ago, but only now did he understand the full weight of what it meant. He knew that time was running out, that the enemies would not wait any longer, and that she needed to know the truth before it was too late. But he also knew the right moment had not yet come. Not until she was ready to understand that her story and the company's story were intertwined in ways no contract could explain. Back in Seoul, Hyun received a new memo. Cold, impersonal, laconic. Report to Room 12B, Compliance Department. Internal evaluation. When she arrived, she found a table surrounded by 3 legal representatives of the company, all with open folders and harsh expressions. She was questioned about her access to old files, the documents she had handled, the copies she had made. Each question came with a tone of accusation, disguised as protocol. She responded clearly, but the atmosphere was oppressive. One of them, with a bitter expression, even asked if she was aware she had broken the rules by accessing restricted documents. Another said that kind of behavior, although understandable given her background, was not acceptable at the level she had been placed. No one said directly that she had been demoted, but the weight of that room made it clear the fall had already begun. Hours later, she returned home in silence. Her mother was sleeping, coughing from time to time. The fridge was nearly empty, and the notebook where she wrote everything was now locked inside a shoebox, hidden in the back of the closet. A storm was brewing, and even if she didn't know where the first thunder would come from, she could feel it in the air. The next day, an envelope was delivered to her door. No sender. Inside, a single printed page, a photograph of her sitting in the archive room, holding the founder's old letter. The caption, written in red letters, read, "You don't belong in this world." She felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. For a moment, she considered giving up everything. But something inside her, something planted long before any of this began, refused to give in. She decided to go to the only person who might be able to help. The night shift security guard, a middle-aged man named Jin Woo, who had once offered her tea when she worked late. He had worked at the company for over 20 years and knew the hallways, secret doors, buried stories. When she showed him the photo, he took a deep breath and said, "There are powerful people trying to hide something you almost uncovered, and that isn't new." Jin Woo revealed that, years ago, another employee had found a similar letter and disappeared a week later, leaving no trace. He also said that the Invisible Roots project had never been officially shut down. It had simply vanished, as if swallowed by a force greater than any hierarchy. That night, Hyun decided to write her own letter. Not as an outburst, but as a capsule of truth in case something happened to her. She wrote about what she had discovered, what she felt, what she suspected. She placed the letter inside a blue-covered book her mother used to read before bed. The book sat on the living room shelf, among other forgotten volumes, as if it were just another one. But to her, it was her last line of defense. The next day, upon arriving at the company, she found something she did not expect. Her old office on the executive floor was open again. An envelope on the table, this time with a sender. Jang Zeke Jin. Inside there was only a note. The time has come. I'm waiting for you where it all began. And along with the note, a rusty key engraved with the initials JGH. Not fully understanding what it meant, she knew she couldn't ignore the summons. She asked for leave for the rest of the day, boarded a bus out of the city, and followed. The address handwritten on the back of the envelope. It was an old house in the countryside, hidden among silent hills. The same house where, at that moment, Sakajin stared at the horizon with a heart at war. When she arrived, he didn't say anything. He simply opened the door with the same silence with which he had hired her. The two sat across from each other, separated by a worn wooden table between two untouched cups of tea. And for the first time, he began to speak. But not everything, not yet, because some truths require the person to be ready to stop being who they were and become who they need to be. That night, the sky over Seoul seemed lower, as if the weight of the decisions about to be made were bending even the firmament. Hyun looked out the bus window as the city lights drew shadows across her tired face. The envelope with her mother's letter rested on her lap, still partially open, like a wound slowly bleeding. She had read and reread every word, every curve of the handwriting that seemed familiar from some hidden place in her memory. But nitrogen monoxide, matter how much she felt something inside her had suddenly fallen into place. The world outside remained disordered and hostile. In the company, the hallways now whispered louder. The glances nitrogen monoxide longer hid their discomfort. She was a walking question mark. And in that structure where everything needed a label and a last name, that was a threat. HR had been ordered to review her entire record. Computers were inspected, old badges analyzed, even her bank data was monitored. As if any trace could be used to build an accusation. But there was nitrogen monoxide flaw. Because until then, all she had done was work and survive. Sadian, on the other hand, knew he was surrounded. The board members were uneasy, the media was circling. And international investors demanded answers. He had received discreet invitations to private meetings where they suggested he step back for a while to preserve the company's market value. But each of these suggestions came with a veiled threat. If he didn't comply, they would create the scandal even if there was none. In this context, he decided to strike first. He called a press conference, personally, in the main auditorium, where he had never spoken publicly since his father's death. The press attended in force, drawn by the mystery. Nitrogen monoxide one knew the topic. There were rumors of a resignation, a merger, a bombshell announcement. But nitrogen monoxide one expected that, when he took the stage, he would bring with him a young woman in simple clothes and determined eyes. The image of them together in front of the podium circulated in seconds on social media. Journalists looked at each other, searching her face for clues. Sa-jin did not introduce her, he just spoke. He sighed that for many years his company had become a symbol of success. But that success had been built on omissions. He saw that values like ethics, truth, and humanity had been lost in the marble halls. And that, from that moment on, he committed to restructuring not just the company, but its conscience. Press grew restless, eager for concrete statements, but he gave nitrogen monoxide names, nitrogen monoxide explanations. he sighed only that some truths need time to mature in people's hearts, and that he would nitrogen monoxide longer comply with structures that chose appearance over essence. When he left the stage, the crowd didn't know if they had witnessed a symbolic resignation or a silent revolution, but they knew something had changed. Backstage, HUNKNOWINGLY was preparing his counterattack. He rallied allies, drafted an open letter to the shareholders, and initiated a legal process to request an independent audit of decisions made over the last 2 years. His intention was clear: to weaken Jin's image as an emotionally stable leader and expose the connection between him and Hyun as something inappropriate and compromising. The war was now declared, but not in courts, in the most dangerous territory: public opinion. Hyun went back to being silently persecuted. Her desk was moved again, this time to a windowless room in the basement. Her access was restricted. Emails were filtered. Colleagues completely ignored her. IT was as if she were trapped in a dome, watched by invisible eyes. But strangely, instead of withdrawing, something inside her began to bloom. For the first time, she knew who she was, and that kept her from bowing down at home. Her mother started to improve. She could now sit up for short periods, and in one of those moments, holding her daughter's hands, she murmured, "You're starting to look like her." When Hyun asked who, the answer came softly: "Your birth mother." The woman who raised her had never spoken that way before. It was as if her silence was finally collapsing, maybe because her daughter was ready to listen, or maybe because time was tired of keeping quiet. Sagin sent a handwritten letter to each board member. Instead of technical defenses, he wrote about what he had observed in recent months. He reported concrete situations of hidden prejudice, institutionalized incompetence, and vanity disguised as meritocracy. He saw the company needed new roots, and that these roots were being strangled by the rotten branches of arrogance. Some board members were moved, others angered, but all knew that something was collapsing, and that if they didn't act fast, they would lose not only control but relevance. On the upper floor, Jinwoo, the old security guard, watched everything with the eyes of someone who had seen too much. He started to store copies of the documents Hyun was examining. He began to label them with false dates, and one night, he gave her a flash drive with files that, according to him, belonged to the Ghost Project. There were photos, scanned letters, names of secret donors, and a list of children registered in the shelter, funded by the company 30 years ago. Among the names was hers. Hyun stayed up all night. She read everything, compared dates, reread her mother's letter, checked public records. She confirmed, painfully, that her birth certificate had been altered twice, and that, officially, there were 3 versions of her story, none of them true. For the first time, she understood that her entire life had been edited to fit the silence of others. The next morning, she left a single handwritten phrase on Jin's desk: "I'm ready to know everything." When he read it, he sighed with the weight of generations on his shoulders. He knew the moment had come, and he knew that, by telling her, he would not only shatter illusions but also what little remained of the legacy he had tried to protect. Meanwhile, HYU activated the final phase of his plan. An anonymous tip to the prosecutor's office. He alleged misuse of resources, illegal favoritism, and concealment of confidential documents. His bet was to create a public crisis large enough that shareholders would demand Jin's immediate resignation and install him in power on an emergency basis. The company hit headlines on every news portal: Jin Empire in crisis. Mysterious CEO involved with employee of unknown origin. Traditional family may have illegitimate heirs. The speculations were wild, but among them, some people began to ask, who is this woman who defies an entire system without saying a word? On the night before the final board meeting, Hyun returned to the old house in the mountains. She walked the halls with slow steps, sat in the same spot where Weeks earlier, she had heard the first truths, and then she asked, "Am I the founder's daughter?" The question hung in the air for a long time. Se-jin did not answer immediately. He walked to the fireplace, took a wooden box, and handed it to her. Inside was a letter written in a trembling hand, the last one from his father, written before his death, and in IT, a single sentence. "My guilt has a name, and that name is Hyun." She closed her eyes, didn't cry, just felt, as if for the first time, she were complete. Not for finally belonging, but for understanding why she always felt different. She wasn't a mistake. She was the consequence of a cowardly choice. And now, she had the chance to turn pain into justice. Before returning to Seoul, she left her notebook on the table in the old house. In IT, a phrase written in dark ink, "They tried to hide me, but I grew up, and now I will be seen." The next morning, she would enter the company's headquarters with what she needed to turn the story upside down. But first, she needed to look each one in the eye and ask, without fear, which side they were on, because there was nitrogen monoxide longer room for those who stood in the middle. On the morning of the decisive meeting, the company's lobby was quieter than ever. Nitrogen monoxide keyboard typing, nitrogen monoxide elevator noise, nitrogen monoxide, spontaneous good morning. IT was as if everyone knew something definitive was about to happen. The board would meet to vote on the CEO's removal. But that day, the seats around the main table would not only be filled by titles, they would be surrounded by secrets, hidden memories, and truths shelved for decades. Hyun arrived early. She wore the same outfit from her first interview. Not out of lack of options, but by choice. That clothing was now a symbol of resistance, of the beginning, the middle, and the new beginning. Her steps echoed through the hallways, but nitrogen monoxide once stopped her. For the first time, she didn't need authorization. Her presence was unquestionable, because what she carried wasn't an opinion. IT was evidence. Se-jin entered soon after. Suit, restrained expression. But in his eyes there was the trace of someone finally free from the fear of displeasing others. He greeted everyone with a brief nod and placed a navy blue folder on the table. He saw that before any vote, he would present facts and then leave the company's fate in the hands of those who called themselves its guardians. The first revelation was controlled. Bank statements showing quiet diversion of funds by Hyun Woo, hidden in shell companies connected to an overseas consortium. Next came letters from the founder, originals with notarized signatures, authorizing donations that never reached their destinations blocked by internal board members. Each document came with an attachment, a date, a signature. The silence was absolute. Some board members looked down. Others stared at the papers as if trying to deny what they saw. But denial was impossible. The evidence was there, concrete, cold, and for that very reason, irrefutable. Then Se-jin stepped away from the table and gave the floor to Hyun. She stood slowly, walked to the center of the room, and opened her own notebook. She said she wouldn't give a speech. She would just read a letter. It was her mother's last letter, written when she was still a child, kept out of fear and hope. The letter told the truth. The secret affair with the founder, the unexpected pregnancy, the cruel separation, the attempt to rebuild life far from the shadow of the empire that had abandoned her. Some board members stood, indignant. One tried to interrupt, saying that it was too personal to be shared there. But she continued, her voice firm. She sighed that the personal and the institutional had always been intertwined. They just chose to hide it when the truth didn't benefit the powerful. And that now here, she demanded not a position, but the dignity that had been denied her since birth. When she finished reading, Se-jin handed the board a legally corrected birth certificate, listed as father, Jen Gung-ho, and as daughter, Kang Ha-eun, now Hyun Jang, the hidden heiress, the invisible root that had been buried to avoid shaming the tree of tradition. But that, even buried, survived. The vote was postponed, not for strategy, but because none of the members there had the courage to put their fingerprints on a document that would try to erase, once again, the founder's legitimate daughter. Some left the meeting. Others asked for time. But what had already been exposed? Could nitrogen monoxide longer be hidden outside the building? The press surrounded the two. Questions were fired like arrows. Are you the founder's daughter? Is it true you were raised in secret? Will you take over the presidency? Eun looked at Asajin, then at the cameras. And simply sighed. I was raised in silence, but today I speak for all the voices that were never heard. In the days that followed, the media was divided. Some praised her as a symbol of overcoming. Others questioned her, accusing her of opportunism, but she didn't respond to any reports. She preferred to act. She created a new department within the company, dedicated to social projects for youth from marginalized communities. She named I to Visible Roots, and chose as its symbol a tree with different leaves, but intertwined roots. Hyunwoo was officially removed. Investigations revealed a history of manipulation that spanned years. With nitrogen monoxide way out, he accepted a plea deal and withdrew from the company. But before leaving, he left a note for Suggi Jin. You won, but this world doesn't forgive those who break the game. And reading that, Suggi Jin just smiled, because deep down, he had never played. He had rebuilt. Hyun continued working, not as an executive, but as a bridge between what the company claimed to be and what IT needed to become. She visited the most forgotten sectors, lunched with interns, listened to stories from security guards, took notes from cleaners. She knew she would never have the automatic respect of those who lived by last names, but she also knew that nitrogen monoxide longer mattered. Her mother, now healthier, started attending some meetings. She sat quietly in the back, her eyes brimming. Once, when a secretary referred to her as MRSJEONG, she smiled sweetly and sighed. Nitrogen monoxide need to call me that. I'm still getting used to this name. It was as if time was finally giving back everything that had been denied. Se-jin stepped down from the presidency after restructuring the main boards. He saw he had done what he needed to do, planted the right seed. He moved to the countryside, where he started a leadership school for at-risk youth. His name disappeared from the headlines, but his legacy remained in every quiet decision that righted injustices once considered normal. A year later, during the company's anniversary event, Hyun took the main stage and was ovationed by every department. There was nitrogen monoxide fear in the applause, nitrogen monoxide obligation in the smiles. There was recognition, there was history, and above all, there was truth. She ended her speech with the same phrase. Her mother used to write in her sewing notebooks, "What is born from the ground knows where it stands." And there, under the lights that once only illuminated the same faces, a new era began, not with fireworks, but with roots. Because what had been denied for generations now bloomed with a name, a face, and dignity. And now I ask you, if you were in Hyun's place, would you have opened that envelope right away? Or would you have waited for the right time, even without knowing if it would come? Leave your answer in the comments. Let's talk. This is your free drama channel here on YouTube. If this story touched you in any way, like, share, and subscribe. Here, the voices that were silenced are finally heard.